So I think I would just ask Stephan, are you ready or are you still on the phone with someone? Okay, then I think I would just give the floor to Stephan and he will start us off and introduce the panelists and what we're talking about today.
Thank you very much, Julia. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm glad that you all took time to join us today. I'm Stephan. I'm a member of the IPB Council and currently president of the Arms Information Center in Switzerland. And it's my pleasure to welcome our speakers today and thank them for being here and giving us a short input about the global net Stop the Arms Trade, of which the IPB is a proud member. I'd like to start with Julia. You already heard her. She will be moderating this session, and she's currently part of the IPB staff in Berlin. And the next one in line and first speaker will be Andrew Feinstein. He's Executive Director of Shadow World Investigations. He will give a short overview over one case of international arms trade to show that arms trade, regardless of if it's small arms or major weapon systems, is an international problem and needs to be addressed on an international level. After that, Ruth is going to have a small invitation for everyone to think about cases like what are they, why we need them, what are we making them for, and maybe how they are made. And afterwards, we will talk about what is needed for those cases, which is most likely transparency. And we will have two examples. One is the example of Jirat, who is with us today. He's a journalist of the Swiss newspaper What's. It's an independent weekly newspaper. So like for the Germans, the Taz, or the people from the United States, like the Mother Jones, or for the one resident in the United Kingdom, it's something like, you know, the quality of the Guardian with the stuff of the New Statesman. And our last but not least speaker is Magdalena. She's vice president of the Arms Information Center in Austria, and she will show you how far apart, even within common frameworks of the European Union, as the GASP, countries can be apart, and how Austria is concerning transparency about arms trades. And afterwards, I would like to invite you to join a discussion and a little Q&A. So, and I would give the floor to Andrew to give us the introduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephan, and it's really good to be here. And hello to everybody from IPB and beyond. For me, as an investigative researcher and writer and campaigner on the global arms trade, I think what the most crucial importance of GNStat is that it brings together cases from around the world in multiple languages in an accessible format, because to understand the arms trade, to understand corruption in the arms trade, one has to have a global lens. One cannot comprehend it by looking only at one's own country or even a specific company. And to give you some of the background to why it operates in this global way and what the implications of that are, I thought that we would very quickly look at the Anglo-Italian company Leonardo. So Leonardo was for many years known as Finmeccanica, was 30% owned by the Italian state, and was involved in innumerable corrupt arms transactions around the world. So a few years ago, in order to try and wash its image, I suppose we could say, it changed its name to Leonardo, supposedly evoking the talents and memories of Leonardo da Vinci, according to a company announcement. Now, my immediate response to that was I didn't realize that Leonardo da Vinci was engaged in corrupt criminal conduct. Because unfortunately, like many defense companies, Leonardo's business model is based largely on corruption. And this applies particularly to its British subsidiary that for many years was known as Augusta Westland, that had been involved in numerous scandals going back even to the 1980s in the United Kingdom and abroad. Augusta Westland is today known as Leonardo Helicopters, and the person who oversaw, as head of the audit committee of the Leonardo Group, who oversaw decades of corruption, in a recent supposed cleansing of the company, this particular person has now become the head of Leonardo Helicopters, which is a quite extraordinary development for me, for a company that is claiming to want to clean up its business practices and images. But why does it need to clean up? Well, I'm going to give you two very, very brief examples. You can read detailed summaries of both of the cases I'm going to refer to on the GN Stat under the reports section. But just to give you a flavor of how these companies operate and how global any transaction is in the global arms trade. So in 2013, the Republic of Korea, what we know as South Korea, decided as a consequence of the sinking of a Korean Navy vessel by North Korea to purchase 8 Wildcat helicopters. This, as I said, is in 2013. The price at the time was about £227 million. But almost as soon as the contracts were signed, allegations of widespread corruption emerged in relation to the Wildcat helicopters. 63 Defense Department and other South Korean officials were arrested. Many of them were charged. The core of the story is that these helicopters needed to be able to hover over the sea to detect North Korean submarines that could be a threat to South Korean naval vehicles. And they had to be able to do this for a period of time. The helicopters that were sold by what was then Augusta Westland could not do that. So officials within the South Korean Ministry of Defense falsified test and evaluation data based on the Wildcat testing, which showed that it didn't meet the technical specifications. For this, they were collectively paid millions of British pounds. But at the center of all of this was a former Veterans Affairs minister in South Korea. So somebody who in the Republic of Korea is held in particular esteem, a gentleman by the name of Yang Kim. He was employed at huge cost by Augusta Westland to effectively corrupt officials, to corrupt the test and evaluation data, to put it very simply. His counterpart in Augusta Westland, who set up this arrangement, was a former defense minister of the United Kingdom by the name of Jeff Hoon. When we started investigating this case, what was extraordinary to us is that Augusta Westland undertook this attempt to corrupt the process of deciding on the helicopter while knowing that any form of lobbying is illegal in the Republic of Korea. And in fact, we managed to access emails from Jeff Hoon to Yang Kim and others demanding that they lobby far more aggressively and vigorously for the considerable sums of money that they had been paid. Now, what has transpired out of this case is that most of the very senior military officials who received all sorts of benefits, jobs for kids, investment in their children's new business startups that didn't go anywhere, that they were all exonerated and found not guilty. And there were only very few people who were actually found guilty of this offense. And one of the reasons for that is that we discovered through our own inquiry that prosecutors in Italy who were investigating Leonardo for this corruption had no communication with prosecutors in South Korea, who were actually investigating the self-same corruption, but from the Korean perspective. And that to us indicated how to be able to investigate these sorts of cases, one has to have global reach. It goes even further. If one looks at another case, that of VVIP helicopters to India. Now, I'd never heard of this phrase VVIP, which I suppose is supposed to mean very, very important people. India was attempting to buy helicopters for amongst its most senior political ministers and officials to be able to travel the country securely. Given that India is a fairly mountainous country, the helicopters had to be able to fly above a certain altitude. Yet again, the helicopter that Augusta Westland offered was incapable of flying higher than 2/3 of the required altitude. But extraordinarily, Augusta Helicopters won the contract. And India, after taking delivery of the first of the helicopters, realized they were absolutely useless and refused to take delivery of the remaining helicopters, which were then sold to Indonesia in another corrupt transaction in which the Indonesian military took the decision to buy these useless helicopters, despite the president's office in Indonesia specifically and explicitly stating that Indonesia would not buy these helicopters. Now, the key intermediary on these deals was a British man by the name of Christian Michel. And we managed to have some communication with Christian Michel. It didn't last for very long, because what then happened was Christian Michel, when he realized he was under threat, moved his operations from Britain to Dubai. Now, the reasons for that in a regulatory and enforcement sense would be obvious. What he didn't realize is that the Indian government was so desperate to have him in jail in India because his evidence implicated the main opposition party that was in government at the time of the deal, the Congress Party. So the Indian government said to the Dubai authorities, we will give you the Saudi royal princess who has fled to India and has been making embarrassing public statements about, the UAE royal family, about the UAE royal family. We will exchange her for Christian Michel. So Christian Michel now finds himself under house arrest in India, where prosecutions into this case continue. In Dubai, there was no legal process, even though they did extradite him in the end. In Italy, the legal process was one of the most complex and confusing I've ever seen in my life, when the two senior executives at Leonardo who were responsible for this deal were found guilty, then found not guilty, then found guilty again, and finally entered into a very strange form of legal settlement in which they effectively admitted guilt without any consequences to themselves or the company. But I think what all of these cases show in just one company is how transnational and global any individual case of an arms deal or corruption in an arms deal actually is. Now, let me remind you briefly that 40% of all corruption in all global trade takes place in the trade in weapons. So a trade that averages about $400 billion a year, which is actually not that big in relative terms, is nevertheless responsible for 40% of all corruption. And the vast majority of that corruption, over 74% according to one OECD study, over 80% according to one Transparency International study, is down to the role of intermediaries and agents, or what we often colloquially refer to as middlemen. And this is not corruption just in the buying country. There is what we call the feedback principle, in terms of which the executives and often the politicians and political parties in the selling country actually receive some of the bribes that are paid out to influential individuals in the buying country. So we have a situation in the most corrupt commercial transaction of all time, the Al Yamama deal, where £6 billion of commissions, what you and I understand as bribes, were paid out. £6 billion. And in case that wasn't enough, the son of the Saudi defense minister at the time, who was then the country's ambassador to the United States of America, also received as a birthday gift from BAE Systems, the British company, a jet airliner made out to his specifications and painted in the colors of his favorite American football team, the Dallas Cowboys. Now, the extraordinary thing is, it wasn't only the Saudis and the middlemen who received bribes. Mark Thatcher, the son of the British Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, was paid £12 million in relation to that deal, just to ensure that anybody who needed it had access to his mother when and as they required it. The chief executive, later executive chairperson of BAE Systems, Sir Richard Evans, was given a luxury apartment in central London, what was worth £6.5 million at the time. And this is going back to the late 1980s, early 1990s. So an absolute fortune at that time. And you know, I gave you the examples of Leonardo. For 17 years, BAE Systems was undoubtedly the most corrupt company on the planet. And it created a bribe-paying and money laundering system that traversed the entire globe. So when investigators like ourselves try to unravel what had actually happened in this transaction, we had to look into money flows that had gone into 24 or 25 different jurisdictions around the world. Today, the BAE Systems of our current time is Leonardo, but it could as easily have been Rheinmetall, Ferrostaal, ThyssenKrupp, Lockheed Martin, Airbus, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Rolls-Royce, or any of the large defense contractors on the planet, because all of them are engaged in massive corruption that is built into the very structure and the very economics of the trade in weapons. And this facilitates the reality that even at the time like today of a global pandemic, even while the world faces the massive challenges of the climate crisis, we spend $1.75 trillion a year on war and on militarism. Because the money that underpins these deals flows around the political processes in almost all of our countries. So in the United States, where the defense companies pay for the campaigns of certain selected politicians who, once they are in Congress, give multi-billion-dollar projects and contracts back to those countries, back to those companies, excuse me. But in the United States of America, that is legal. It's what I refer to as legalized bribery. In European countries and the United Kingdom, it is not, but it happens on the same scale. For instance, Helmut Kohl, Germany's unifying chancellor, funded his Christian Democratic Union party largely on the proceeds of licit and illicit deals, arms deals, for 16 years. So the information that GNStat communicates, the information about how we go about actually making these cases, is absolutely crucial if we are to end the corrupt, deadly global arms trade that we have today. So to make our societies more democratic, more accountable, less corrupt, and more safe, please pay careful attention to the information that is on GNStat and how we manage to put that information into the public domain. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's always a pleasure to hear you speak. And it was amazing how you, again, drew the connection between specific cases, the individuals involved, which then actually ends up creating a network of global dimensions and the all-encompassing presence of corruption within the arms trade, which is, as we know, in direct opposition to our democratic values. I'm going to give the floor now to Ruth Rhode, who is today going to explain to us how to make a case for the GN stats and how to be part of this amazing initiative. So I'm just going to give the floor to this incredible young woman who's been an arms trade campaigner for already a disproportionate amount of time in her life.
Thank you, Julia. Always a pleasure. And Andrew, of course, is always a tough act to follow. Yet I'll do my best in a very short amount of time. I still want to begin by taking a tiny step back, because I think it is really important to recall how the arms trade relies on practices of globalism if we want to understand exactly why the global net exists, what it does, and what its cases are supposed to do. Andrew has already given us an example, but I want to make very briefly 3 more points about why I think the arms trade relies on aspects of internationality more than do other businesses. First of all, I think it's really important to remember that as long as the arms industry continues to seek to combine capitalism and capitalism-oriented profit generation, and this is combined with the idea of military state sovereignty, we are going to see an arms trade, because the argument goes something like this: if a country needs an independent sovereign defense industry, there are just so many warships, tanks, and even rifles the single country can buy. Therefore, the country needs to export them. This is the argument that is often made. And this means that a fight against the military-industrial complex is also a fight against the arms trade. Secondly, internationalized business models, as we see them in the arms trade right now, as Andrew has already pointed out with Leonardo, creates the conditions where these arms companies can exploit legal gray areas. They can exploit it when the Italian prosecutors and the Korean prosecutors don't communicate effectively with each other. They can exploit it when we have different regulatory frameworks in different countries. They can exploit it when countries just simply don't care under whose jurisdiction Rheinmetall, for example, produces bombs on Sardinia, Italy, and whether this is a German concern or an Italian concern, these bombs will be dropped on the people of Yemen either way. So lastly, I think it's really important to remember that the arms trade thrives on intransparency. Andrew has already mentioned the omnipresent practices of corruption that are present in the arms trade, and this type of behavior is especially easy to cover up when you can operate internationally. And therefore, the arms trade has an interest in covering its tracks by exploiting not only challenges in transnational law enforcement, but also challenges in transnational activism. And that is exactly where we come in. That is where organizations like Shadow World Investigations, RIB, or the IPB for that matter, but especially GNStat as a project come in. The global net was founded on a simple premise. The arms trade is operating globally, and thus so must the peace movement. And if the global military-industrial complex plays on an international stage, so this must be reflected in the stories that the peace movement tells about them. And this is exactly what global net cases aim to do. So I tried to come up with like a little definition of a GN case for you guys. So a GNStat case is a report, usually written by several authors, summarizing complex his and her stories by zooming in on the arms trade component, on the transnational arms trade component. These cases are sometimes, but not always, based on original research. They can also synthesize knowledge available in the public domain, and actually a lot of our cases are primarily based on knowledge that's already available in the public domain. And they are supposed to be a starting point for further research and can also provide links to people and sources of contacts for those who are affected by or interested in a particular arms deal. So GN-STAT cases usually consist of 3 pillars. First of all, they shine a light on a transnational arms deal or series of arms deals. Spoiler alert, that's almost all arms deals. Then secondly, what Andrew has already touched upon, language is a key feature here. So we translate all of our cases, at least into the languages of the countries that are concerned by the arms deal. So when we were writing about Israel, we have a translation into Hebrew. When we're writing about Mexico, we organize for a translation into Spanish. When we're writing about anything in the world, we always translate into English. This is supposed to give an easier access to the communities that are affected by the arms deals, either as the exporting countries, for example, Germany, the UK, and the countries where the weapons end up. And lastly, the last pillar would be collaboration. So we're trying to, as we progress, get better and better at this, at including people who are actually involved or are actually concerned by these arms deals in various capacities, and have several authors for each case so that nobody faces the challenge of writing a case by themselves. So let me just give a brief example of how this is done. Currently, we have 7 GN-STAT cases. 5 of them are published. 1 is coming up, and 1 is currently being written. So a crucial example is the German G36 exports to Mexico. G36 is an assault rifle produced by Heckler & Koch. This deal was legal and was largely uncovered by Jürgen Gresslin, who is also present here and who co-founded the Global Net Stop the Arms Trade. So to cover this arms deal, we at the GN-STAT, we wrote a long report, a short report, and then we added additional supplementary materials. We had trial monitoring of the associated legal proceedings in Germany and a company chronicle about the history of Heckler & Koch, which is pretty much unique. And Jürgen can tell you all about that later, maybe in the Q&A. So what is the purpose of this? We have the long report. The long report is for all those that are interested in the details of the case. They're supposed to give all the facts, the data that we have. Sometimes they include even snippets of original and primary documents. The short report is supposed to be a summary. It's supposed to be for if somebody wants to just quickly read up on a case, they can go to the short report and find all the most relevant information. Then the supplementary materials are there to not only contextualize the case, but also be used for outreach. So the trial monitoring was done in cooperation with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, which is a foundation here in Germany. And we wrote down for every day, there were people who wrote down what was happening, what was going on in the courtroom. And we translated that into English and Spanish. And we like to believe that that helped people also, for example, in Mexico, to connect the case and communicate it to their own constituencies. So this is a primary way in which we would try to create a collaborative spirit and to make people from different communities have access to information about these arms deals to organize globally. So, but now we're also trying to more and more increasingly collaborate with people who are affected by these arms deals. For example, on our current case 7 that is currently being created, we are working with Ralph Willinger of Terre des Hommes, a children's rights organization, and Oponoya Innocent, who is a former child soldier in Uganda. So this is supposed to make it possible for us to not only talk about people who become victims of our arms exports from arms exporting countries, but also talk with them and have them be integrated into our case reports so that we can become true to our motto, which is a name and face to the perpetrators and a voice to the victims of global arms exports. Okay, I know I'm running out of time. Where do we go from here? GNSAT is a volunteer-run organization. And so what we need are more volunteers doing bottom-up research to get at the underbelly of the global arms industry and make some noise. Specifically, what all organizations or anyone who lives anywhere close to an arms manufacturer, for example, can contribute are photos that we have a license to, that we can use in our reports to illustrate them, documents. People who speak several languages can volunteer to translate. And also my personal wish would be that we would at one point find somebody who is into doing social media for the global net, Stop the Arms Trade. So all of this we need to together challenge the structures that sustain the global arms trade, like militarism and intransparency, to support victim organizations in their calls for justice, and to tell our governments and arms manufacturers, not in our name. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. This was really interesting. I knew about the Globalism, but I wasn't aware of the reach that it actually had. So this was actually really informative for me as well. I really love that you highlighted the collaborative spirit and like the globality of the project, and also that you're more and more working with the people that are actually directly negative impacted by the arms trade, which I think this is something that the global peace movement needs, that we're actually highlighting and empowering individuals that are the ones that are most directly affected. I'm now going to give the floor to Jirat, where I hope that I didn't butcher your name, from Die Wochenzeitung in Zurich, and he will talk about an example of good transparency related to Switzerland. So Jan, if you would take the floor. You still are muted. If you could unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, very good. Thank you for having me. It's an honor, and I really look forward also to the discussion after that. And it's as a journalist, it's good to see so much people being involved in research and in doing so much good stuff, better than I would say than we usually do. So I would like to talk about a case we had here in Switzerland that started in 2014 when the official statistics about arms exports were published here in Switzerland of the State Secretariat of Economic Affairs, that is part of the Federal Department of Economic Affairs. And I try to tell a story about arms exports and the whole topic, and it's almost very abstract. There was a number, for example, 564 million Swiss francs. That was the number of export of war material. That is about 520 million euros. And you could see in the statistics also to which country the war material was exported and the category of the material. For example, fire and handguns, munition, fire control systems, tanks. So I had all those numbers, and all I knew was a few names of the arms manufacturers. And I realized that my picture of the whole complex was very vague and very abstract. So I was thinking about a way as a journalist to change that, to get a more concrete picture and more information about the names, the faces behind those companies, the addresses that produce arms here in Switzerland. And we have, since 2006, a federal law on transparency in administration. So I sent an official request to the Federal Department of Economic Affairs. That is the state agency that is responsible for export control. And in this request, I demanded the list of all the companies that submitted an official export approval for war material and for specific military goods. I think this is kind of a Swiss speciality. We have a second category of arms products called the specific military goods. The best known of those goods is probably the training jet of Pilatus. That is, they export this jet to, for example, Saudi Arabia, and it's the most famous product of this category. And the interesting point about this is that those goods are put under a different law that is much less strict than the law for war material. So I wanted the names of those companies as well. And I wanted also the information of the total annual sum per country of the export approvals and the category. This means my request was condensed. I did not want the information of every single export approval, because that would have been without any chance of winning. The companies would all refer to business secrecy. So that's why I made this condensed request. In the end, it took us 5 years, and it cost us more than 5,000 Swiss francs for the handling fee of the Federal Department of Economic Affairs. But finally, this June, we got the names, we got that list. And I have to say that there were two main points that made this success possible. One is we had a very good lawyer. And the second point is that we had the recommendation of the Federal Data Protection and Information Commissioner that said you have to publish the list. And this agency has the function of an arbitration board. And I have to say that it's really good to have this arbitration board here in Switzerland concerning freedom of information cases. So in June 2020, we finally got the list with all the names of the companies that submitted an official export approval for war material, A and B specific military goods. It was about 120 names per year in the list of war material and around 30, 35 in the list of specific military goods. And for us, it was a huge step forward in terms of being able to make a classification of the arms industry here in Switzerland and to get a picture of the structure. Because before that, publicly known were very few huge companies and global actors like Rheinmetall Air Defense. We have MOVAG here, they produce the Piranha, the infantry fighting vehicle, and RUAG. And then we have also a few gun and rifle producers that you maybe know, Sig Sauer and BNT, which was founded by Heinrich Thome. He's a notorious arms trader, and you probably know him from War Dogs, and it's also a Hollywood movie. And a few munition producers like RUAG or Saltec. But most of the companies on that list were unknown, and most of those unknown companies were suppliers, component suppliers. And so we did two things after we got the names and the informations. We published a rather big article in our newspapers called What's die Wochenzeitung, where we tried to paint a clear picture of the structure of the arms industry in Switzerland, the classification. So the government is always describing that industry as very important for security reason and for independency in the arms trade sector. And it's a joke. I mean, we have a few capabilities, but we are not at all independent. I mean, our industry can produce very few pure products. And especially the narrative that the sector is, that the backbone of that sector are small and medium-sized enterprises is wrong, totally wrong. It's totally dominated by a very few big companies. So we tried in that article to make that structure clear, and we had an example, for example, to build up the role as a supplier with FireGuard. This is a fire control system of Rheinmetall that is exported to Avibras in Brazil for the production of the multi-rocket launcher Astros 2, a product used of Saudi Arabia military forces in the war in Yemen. That was one example to show a supplier product. And the second thing we did was we set up a website. It's called Rüstungsreport. Can you, oh, sorry, of course you can read it. It's called rüstungsreport.ch. where we published all the names of the companies that submitted an official export approval for war material and specific military goods for more than 100,000 Swiss francs in the year 2017. That was our reference year. And the website was based on a map of Switzerland. So as a user, you could check out where in your neighborhood there is an arms producer. And for every company, we wrote a little profile, also with the support of Stephan from the International Peace Bureau. Thanks for that again. And that publication also from the website was quite a huge success here. It got a lot of attention. The national television did an input, and a lot of regional media outlets were writing articles based on informations of that website. And our readers were very happy to finally have the information public, as we informed them about the whole freedom of information process that took us 5 years. And it also had a political impact, because this weekend we have a vote about a ban for our national bank and for our retirement funds. So very large institutional investors. The vote is about to ban those companies to invest in companies that produces war material. So the government and the opposition of that referendum, they were saying that this will be very dangerous for our arms industry, and that it will affect 3,000 companies. And that's definitely absolutely not true. And our data, our list gave evidence for that, because there are around 60 companies that are dependent of arms exports, as our data was showing, and maybe 60 or 100 other companies that are dependent of our national arms market here in Switzerland, but never 3,000. So what the government and the opposition of that referendum made was that they were counting all the companies that produces war material, specific military goods, and dual-use products as affected of the referendum. So a lot of newspapers and media outlets were using our data and story for verification, and that's probably the biggest impact of this case. That public is now much more informed about the structure and the importance and the classification of our arms trade industry. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jan. This was actually, I mean, I'm just really positively surprised that they just decided to ban for the national banks and retirement funds to divest in the arms trades, or in arms producers, sorry to clarify. I hadn't actually heard about it yet, so this is kind of one of the latest positive examples of actually peace movements and anti-arms production activism. And I think we should just highlight that for a really quick second, because it sometimes feels like it's a very, I mean, for the young people in this room, we've just started working on this, but from what we've learned, it seems like a very long process to ever really make steps forwards in regards to disarmament. And it's really incredible that your investigation and your freedom of information request has actually had that kind of long-reaching impact. And of course, it was like 5 years of work and like financial investments. And sometimes it must have felt really like a massive time investment into one project, and you don't always know where it leads. But this is really an incredible example of how activism around this topic can really have impacts on national legislature and just who we want to invest in and who, yeah. Just thank you so much for this contribution. I'm now going to hand over to Magdalena Friedl from the Rüstungsinformationsbüro, who will now give us a slightly more negative example of bad transparency taking place in Austria. So Magdalena, if you want to take it from here, thank you so much.
Yeah, I have to thank, I hope everyone can hear me, is the first question. And then I have to thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to all of you. It's always hard to be the last speaker because everyone is already fed up with information. So I will try to keep it as short as possible. I'm talking about the transparency in arms trade affairs in Austria. Mainly Austria has a different approach concerning the transparency in general you can't have a problem with transparency if there is none. That would be the really short version, but let me tell you a little bit more. Austria exports arms to foreign countries like all the other countries do, mostly to the USA and the EU, but also to Canada, to the Oman, and to Saudi Arabia. However, Austria gives little information about these exports, where exactly we are delivering and to why, not even to its own citizens. So every Austrian cannot ask questions about it. Of course, Austria has to report regularly to the EU on what it has exported, and we also have to give the EU national reports what we export. But above, these reports usually contain only the bare essentials, so not everything, but only what is relevant to the EU and nothing more, nothing less. And if you ask the responsible ministries, of which, by the way, are 5 depending on the item which is exported, the answer is always that it's, the necessary figures have been sent to the EU and that more detailed information would endanger national security. So basically, the Austrian arms export is state secret, which is kind of funny, but not really. But what does Austria actually export? Are we relevant to the global arms trade? The answer to this question is yes and no. I mean, we are not like Germany, one of the major suppliers on the global stage, but we are the biggest small arms supplier to the United States. So it's no surprise that Austria's largest turnover is also in small arms and ammunition, which the most famous company would be Glock. I think you all have heard of the company. And the second place comes, in second place comes vehicles and accessories for them, where the largest customers are Australia and Algeria, but the United Arab Emirates also play an important role. The point of this here is now, I can't say more about this because besides the United Nations Register for Conventional Arms and the EU reports, there are no state-given information about the arms trade in Austria. So we need information about Austrian weapons used in different countries to backtrack them. So basically, we ask other countries what weapons Austria has exported to them. And for that reason, the Arms Information Center in Austria is part of the global net Stop the Arms Trade, to be in contact with other international NGOs to follow the trail of blood and money from Austria all over the world. Thank you. I made it short.
You did. I'm really impressed. I think that's one of the first times that someone was actually doing less time at any webinar that I've ever been at. Thank you so much for highlighting how, yeah, the national security excuse is actually still very present in the discourse at most countries and is still reflected within their legislation, and then also how that actually undermines transparency mechanisms that are set more on an international level, like the EU or other community. So I think with your speech, that was very on the point. Thank you so much. We are actually hereby closing the formal session of the webinar. If you're happy with this to keep on being recorded, I would also like to record the Q&A session. If anyone is not happy with that and would feel less comfortable with it, then please just put, I don't know, a comment in the chat or just raise your hands. Otherwise, we would keep the recording running, and then I would give the floor to Terry Crawford Brown, who posted a question in the chat. If you would be comfortable to actually pose this question to the speakers yourself, that would be great. Thank you for attending.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I gave a thumbs up. Yeah, we can hear you. It's a little bit broken off. But yeah,
yes,
just start.
Here, I'm in Cape Town, South Africa. I'm the country coordinator for War Beyond War. But I want to pick up on Ruth's reference to Rheinmetall and how it bypasses German arms export regulations by deliberately locating its production in countries such as South Africa. We have 4 plants here in South Africa, the main one being on the outskirts of Cape Town, where about 85% of its production is for export, primarily in the past to Saudi Arabia and UAE, where those munitions have been used in the war in Yemen. In fact, in 2016, Rheinmetall designed and installed a $240 million ammunition factory in Saudi Arabia and got our former president, Jacob Zuma, together with Mohammed bin Salman to open the factory. The uproar about the humanitarian situation in Yemen finally prompted and shamed our government into suspending exports to UAE and Saudi Arabia. But meanwhile, Rheinmetall has negotiated a major export contract to Turkey, which is also the subject of a German arms embargo because of the human rights abuses with the Kurds. So a month after the COVID lockdown and aviation restrictions, 6 flights of Turkish A400M military aircraft, air freighters, arrived in Cape Town Airport and uplifted 6 loads of Rheinmetall munitions. Just a few days before the Turkish offensive in Libya. We don't know yet the extent of how many of those munitions were used in that offensive, or indeed whether they've been turned against the Kurds in Syria and Iraq, or indeed in the Armenia war. There is, as you know, the Disarm Rheinmetall movement in Germany, and in 2019 I was provided with a proxy shares which enabled me to attend the AGM in Berlin. Unfortunately, this year, of course, with lockdown restrictions, that wasn't possible. But there will be, I understand, a United Nations Bundestag public hearings in the Bundestag in May on how to close these loopholes in German arms export regulations, that companies like Rheinmetall deliberately locate their production in places like South Africa. In the meantime, Rheinmetall has a 51% controlling interest in what is known as Rheinmetall Denel Munitions. Denel is a state-owned arms company which is facing bankruptcy, so we don't know what the consequences of that will be. Some rumors going around the workers that Rheinmetall might in fact withdraw from South Africa if it is unable to export to the Middle East. Our National Conventional Arms Control Act says that South Africa will not export weapons to countries that abuse human rights and or to regions in conflict and or countries subject to UN arms embargoes. Unfortunately, that legislation has been flouted ever since it was established in 2002. Hopefully, we're bringing this to the attention of the National Conventional Arms Control Committee, which is headed up by the Minister in the Presidency, but so far everything has been swept under the carpet. But the other related issue is, what do we do with what we assume will be a highly contaminated ammunition factory that was in the heart of, was pivotal to the arms corps era. In this plant, about 45 kilometers from the Cape Town CBD, on the fringe of Cape Town. It is now an area of major development, and so the local population is increasingly concerned about the contamination effects. How then would we be able to decontaminate it? Could it ever be fit for human habitation? And what might be the alternatives, such as renewable energy issues? So in that respect, I think the Germans would have an awful lot to teach us, and we look forward to developing these kind of relationships. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry, for contributing this really insightful case study from South Africa. It was really interesting to hear. I think what we've been moving towards at IPB as well is that we actually have to have a way more intersectional conversation about peace building and disarmament work, because exactly, you can't just talk about peace building and disarmament within a bubble, but you also need to talk about, okay, what are actually the environmental impacts of these production plants, the fighter jets, the how does that actually interconnect with other social justice issues? I feel like the ending had some very specific questions also on how to actually turn around those companies, basically, and how to improve the situation for the local population specifically. If someone would like to respond from the speakers, could you raise your hands? Andrew, if you would want to go, that would be brilliant.
Hi, Terry. Good to see you. Just a couple of quick points relating to that. I think what Terry was covering really highlights something that perhaps we didn't speak about enough in our presentations, which is the impact of the arms trade on local communities. And that manifests in so many different ways. The one sort of obvious way is that this business draws money out of usually very urgent socioeconomic needs. So Terry and ourselves have worked extensively on the South African arms deal, in which South Africa spent $10 billion on weapons that the country had absolutely no need of and has barely used today. And this was at the time that our then President Thabo Mbeki was saying we had no financial resources to provide antiretroviral medication for 6 million South Africans living with HIV and AIDS. According to a very sort of cautious study done by the School of Public Health at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, this led to the deaths, the avoidable deaths over the next 5 years of over 360,000 South Africans, the birth every year for 5 years of HIV positive, of 32,000 HIV positive babies, because we couldn't afford mother-to-child transmission treatment, etc. I also just want to make the point, and I unfortunately can't talk publicly about this much at the moment, but there is a great deal of work going on with relation to the sort of the avoidance of arms export controls. And I think the issue of arms export controls is an incredibly important one in this context. We've seen with the Yemen conflict, where the Saudi UAE-led coalition has been shown by the UN expert panel on Yemen in a number of reports to be continuing to be involved in violations of international humanitarian and human rights law and in war crimes in Yemen. And in countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Spain, it has made absolutely no difference to arms export controls. They are effectively just being ignored, because in terms of every European country, the UK and the US, exporting to Saudi Arabia and UAE, and I should add Canada to that, while they are committing violations of IHL and war crimes, is against national legislation. It's against multilateral legislation or agreements such as the EU Common Position, and it's in violation of the International Arms Trade Treaty. And countries like Canada and the UK and others claim to be champions of the Arms Trade Treaty. The only reason they champion it is because it's so weak and unenforceable that it has no impact whatsoever. But I think we are at a critical moment in terms of arms export controls globally. Because one, we're seeing that they seem to be voluntary. A British court, the appeal court, declared sales to Saudi Arabia unlawful. It made absolutely no difference to the UK government, which continued the exports as normal. And Magdalena, we have exactly the same transparency issues that you experience in Austria, in the United Kingdom, where anything to do with the arms trade at all is a matter of national security, and therefore no information is released. And the reality is that that hides illegal conduct in relation to controls on the one hand, and it hides criminal conduct, both in relation to the weaponry and to the corruption that is taking place in these transactions. And that's why this national security imprimatur is so important and has been so abused in so many countries. But it also, and this will be the last thing I say, it also speaks to a new phenomenon of what is being referred to as offshoring, whereby where there is a country that has okay arms export controls, like Germany. So Germany has a suspension on sales to Saudi Arabia, even though that excludes German components in any European weapons systems, which probably accounts for a huge percentage of German exports. But in theory, German arms export controls are a little bit stronger than, say, British. So companies like Rheinmetall and others effectively offshore their production. And that is now going to a dangerous degree. It's not just the RDM situation in South Africa, which is really, really worrying. I mean, we don't even know, and Terry, you might have a view on this, we don't even know whether any of the equipment actually goes through South Africa at all. For all we know, it could just be a phantom destination to make the export of these goods to Saudi Arabia easier. But we are seeing it at an even more extreme level in that SAMI, Saudi Arabian Military Industries, which is this conglomerate of the Saudis, to try and effectively be able to produce all their weaponry themselves so that arms export controls are completely meaningless. Today, SAMI is led by, as its CEO, the former CEO of Rheinmetall. So this whole push by countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to effectively be completely lawless in their military production is being facilitated and enabled by big Western companies. And the reality is German arms export controls do give it authority over that. Germany has authority whenever intellectual capital that has root in Germany is used in the production of a weapons system. But Germany chooses to do absolutely nothing about it. So these are the sorts of challenges that we face. And these are the sorts of challenges that GNStat can be so useful in helping us on, because the links are so global and so myriad. Sorry, that was longer than I intended to be, Julia.
Julia, we can't hear you.
Hello?
Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry. I think my microphone went out for a sec. I just wanted to say that it was a great commentary. Okay, now I'm repeating myself. But I think it really interlinked it also again back to the GNStat and the role that we're having, the role that it's playing basically to highlight the global patterns and specifically what these subsidiaries are doing to basically violate national law by just outsourcing the locations. I think, Terry, if you would be interested, it sounded in the end that you wanted to maybe get in contact with some organizations that are working specifically on Rheinmetall in Germany and are doing activism here on the ground. I know that the RIP is doing some really amazing initiatives on that. And I think, IPB also always works against national arms producers. So if you would want to contact any of the two organizations, we would be very happy and honored to talk more to you about it and possible avenues of activism against it.
Thank you. I am obviously in contact with the Disarm Rheinmetall movement, but also the Bundestag Arms Control and Arms Control Committee ahead of hopefully the public hearings next year. And when I was in Berlin, we did have a meeting with the Department of Economic Affairs regarding arms export violations and the question of jurisdiction. And one issue that came up is that if Rheinmetall uses NATO standard equipment and exports it as NATO standard, then in fact it would be a violation of German export regulations, and that might be a means into bringing this to German attention and action.
Amazing. Thank you for that clarification. Jürgen, do you want to jump on that and give us some more information on Rheinmetall and activism?
Yeah, many thanks. Thanks to you all, to Terry and to Andrew and the others. We are working since many years on Rheinmetall cases of exports. And maybe Rheinmetall is one of the reasons why we found the global net stop the arms trade, because we were very successful in regulations against Rheinmetall in Germany. But the result was that Rheinmetall was leaving Germany in parts. So producing ammunition in Italy, producing ammunition and ammunition plants in South Africa in connection with the NIL, as we heard. So what we can do is three things. One is we founded critical shareholders in Germany against Rheinmetalls, and we went to all the annual meetings every year at the Rheinmetall Assembly in Berlin, and we have a lot of protests against Rheinmetall, a successful protest. The second is we work together with ECCHR. It's an organization of lawyers who made complaints against Rheinmetall and other companies in front of the International Court in Den Haag, which is going on at that time. And the third is that we inform in the global net, Stop the Arms Trade, in several languages, what is Rheinmetall doing. So, Terry, if you want to work together with us, it would be very helpful and very sensible to do this.
Well, I think...
Thank you. I value that opportunity. I did speak at a local webinar earlier this month on the issue of South African complicity with Turkey in exporting weapons that we assume have been used in war crimes in Libya and elsewhere. We need the proof for that. But I can send that to Andrew. I've got Andrew's email address, and perhaps, Andrew, you could then distribute it to the members here.
I think Andrew confirmed that with a nod in case you didn't see it, Terry. Okay, I think this is already a very positive outcome to this webinar. Some disarmament activists are more connected than before, which is basically what we're working towards if we want to fight against global corruption within the arms trade and arms trade in general. I haven't seen any more questions in the chat. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But if anyone still has a question or comment that they would like to contribute, I would be very happy to give them the floor.
Let me do give you an additional fact. What we are doing with the global net is, and with the organizations we work together with the global net is, that we make complaints against the companies if we have information from whistleblowers about illegal arms exports. So we made complaints in 2010 against Heckler & Koch. And in 2019, the district court in Stuttgart passed a sentence. So Heckler & Koch has to pay a lot of money. And Heckler & Koch and two members of Heckler & Koch have a huge problem because they now are in suspended sentence. And if there's any illegal case, they will go to prison. So much more information we have now about an illegal case of the second large arms producer in small arms is 6 Sauer. In Germany and in the United States, it's here 6 Sauer Incorporation. We made a complaint in 2014 against 6 Sauer because of delivering 38,000 pistols illegal from United States. Delivering from Germany to United States was legal, but it was illegal to re-export the weapons from the United States to Colombia, where there's a civil war. So there was a sentence against 6 Sauer, and the CIO of 6 Sauer Incorporation in United States, Ron Cohen, and Michael Lüke, which is a CIO from 6 Hour here in Germany, were suspended sentence too. And now we have new information about illegal exports from 6 Hour, again from Germany to United States, and then to Mexico, to Colombia, and to Nicaragua. So we made a second complaint, and at that time, what can I say, the public prosecutor made formal accusations at that time, and we will see what happens, but I will be not surprised if there is a second case in court in Kiel in northern Germany. And then we don't talk about suspended sentence, then we talk about prison. So what we can do is, with the Global Net Stop the Arms Trade, is to make the complaints together with other organizations, and to report about these complaints in several languages like English, Spanish, French, Italian, and so on, and give informations to journalists and to lawyers and to members of the peace movement and the Third World movement all around the world. I think this is a job we have to do at that time and in the future too.
Andrew? Did you want to comment on that, or did you just raise your hand? Sorry.
Very quickly, if I could. Sorry, can you hear me? Just related to what Jürgen has said, and it also feeds back to what Terry has said, and again, reflects the sort of role that GN Stat can be playing, is I'd be very interested to hear from Jan, because I think that this idea of the combination of the revealing of information, campaigning using that information, and strategic litigation, which obviously RIB does, we do some of. The one place you don't hear that much about it is in Switzerland. And I'd be curious to hear from Jan if there has been much strategic litigation in Switzerland around Swiss arms exports. And then, I mean, I'm also saying that given the sort of very recent, incredibly close referendum on the decision to purchase or not to purchase jet fighters at exorbitant cost from Switzerland. For Switzerland from wherever.
Well, I think in that case, if we don't have any more questions, or Jan, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah.
Or?
Yes. Thanks for the question, Andrew. There have not been a lot of litigations about arms exports, and there have been one with BNT, the company I already mentioned. There it was about an export through New Zealand that ended up in Kazakhstan, and this is certainly not an exception. It's something that a lot of companies are doing, that they are taking third country ways to export their products. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of litigations here in Switzerland. Probably one reason for that is that we have a very unique political system. That so we for example, we are as citizens, we are able to make popular initiatives. I already mentioned the popular initiative about the ban for the National Bank and our pension funds to invest in arms producers. And we have an organization, they are called Group for Switzerland Without an Army. It's a huge organization. They have hundreds, I think thousands of members, and they are really strong. So a lot of political work is on that level, on popular initiatives, on referendums, and less on litigations. Yeah. But probably we should change that.
Did someone still want to react to that? Or I mean, I totally agree. I think then in this case, we have now heard about the the bad examples of transparency in different countries, as well as the usage of subsidiaries to go around legal restrictions to arms trade countries who are in violation of international human rights law. And as Jan has so beautifully highlighted, also the more promising and positive examples of good governance that were brought about by ground level activism, bottom up approaches. And this is kind of bringing us back to what the GNStat is really about and what they're working towards, to have this bottom up approach of making information available, making it transparent, and by that actually keeping or holding organizations to account. I think at this point, if there's no more commentary or question, I would like to thank the speakers and the panelists for their amazing contributions, and thank all the attendees as well for taking their time and working on this amazing and really important topic. And I hope that all of you will consider joining the GNStat, because the more the merrier, and the more young activists especially are involved in the disarmament work, the better. It's amazing what you can do with a couple of people, from my experience. So if everyone is happy with that, I'm calling the session to a close and just saying thank you again.
Thank you, Julia, and to GNStat for organizing.
Thanks, Julia.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Julia. And then have a nice day and enjoy your time.
Mm.